I think there's a lot of misconceptions about this, especially since people haven't been checking into the war as much as they used to, either because their attention has been drawn away to the war in Gaza, or their attention has been drawn away to other domestic political crises, cultural war issues, or the fact that the war is dragged on for, 4, soon to be going on 5 years. And so, with that much time, people's attention are drawn away. And so they start seeing headlines, which are true. And I don't want to take away from the significance of the headline, but I do want to, add a million asterisks to what exactly this may mean, because people are taking a lot of assumptions from it. But Ukraine, in the last week, has taken back more land from the Russians than they have in any period since 2023 in that short of a time span. Around 200 square kilometers of territory. Now, that is a significant amount of land, but also I do want to be clear that Ukraine is a very big country. And when we're looking at maps, like this is the assessed control of terrain from ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, which in my opinion is not the best mapper, but they are an okay mapper. As I've recommended many times before, I'm a Ukraine Daily Updates guy. I'm a Ukraine Daily Updates kind of guy, okay? But you can see these gains, and they are significant. You can see there has been movement to take back the area around Dobropila. There has been multiple, like half a dozen villages where the Ukrainians have re-entered and it looks like that they're documented to have recaptured to what extent, as in, do they have it solidly? Do they control it a little bit? I think when it comes to some of these villages, they have shaking control, and some of them they've gotten semi-solid control. When I say semi-solid control, let me just say this is very relative to what semi-solid control can be, and I'm dictating that from Russian media, state media, not state media, but Russian Telegram assessment. State media is having a lot of a different conversation about this, and we'll talk about that later. But Russian Telegram channels, where they're talking about Ukrainian solid control of some of these areas, because the Ukrainians, while they are talking about it, they aren't going out there and capturing a village and immediately going out to announce it. A lot of times, you'll find it out from the Russians first, because the Ukrainians kind of want to wait until they have a solid control before they announce it, wanting to maintain some element of surprise if they can. That isn't always the case, mind you, because a lot of these local social media channels or whatever, they'll put stuff out. Somebody posts something on social media. But they've captured about 200 square kilometers around here in the Zaporizhia Oblast, here in the Dnipro Oblast, which the Russians crossed over from the Donetsk Oblast not too long ago. I mean, I was there for when that happened during the end of last year. I was filming our last documentary, which we published on our last channel, showing that. And the Ukrainians were able to take back a village around here and some of the territory between other villages. And altogether, if you look at the area around the Zaporizhia axis, so this is the area beneath the city of Zaporizhia and in between them and the city of Arihiv, which we filmed in for our artillery documentary back in the day. You can see that the Ukrainians have launched some counterattacks. They have made some progress. This is from Rybar. This is a very pro-Russian. This is literally Russian Telegram mapper, social media guy. I don't want to say guy, team, where they put out very pro-Russian perspective mapping after talking to Russian soldiers and units out in the field. But their mapping also is based a lot upon what the Russian government puts out. And I want to throw out there that the first reason why we're seeing this 200 square kilometer capture, the largest capture of territory since 2023, which again, we should not downplay, but I want, before we describe where this is coming from, I do want to give you guys the perspective of, here is Ukraine Daily Updates. This is who I think is the most accurate mapper, because if something isn't geolocated, it is not shown. That doesn't mean it isn't captured. It is just that if it's not shown, then we cannot know. And I like that certainty, and I like that the yellow in between shows what we don't know. And it's not just simply red, blue, there's a blurriness in between, because obviously the Russians and Ukrainians have different reports. You can believe whatever report you want. You can have sources on the ground, which I know are reliable. I can talk to soldiers and know, yeah, soldiers and know, hey, yes, I know this position is held by the Ukrainians because I know a guy that is in that trench, or I know a guy in the press team who talked to XYZ. Anyway, this blurriness here, you can see they've launched counteroffensives from the Zaporizhia axis. You can see they've launched very localized tactical counteroffensives in the Dnipro axis and the Zaporizhia direction. They have captured some villages, but in the grand scheme of things, this is how big Ukraine is. So it's not a advancement that is going to liberate the Donetsk region, the Zaporizhia region, or even really push the Russians out of the Dnipro region, likely, which would probably be the only thing that's in the realm of possibility in the immediate term, considering the amount of forces that Ukraine has at its disposal in the area that it has concentrated to do these types of attacks, and the reasons why this is happening in the first place. So let's get to that. Because even though this is a lot of territory being taken relative to what Ukraine has taken in a short period of time before when it comes to retaking territory, this is not just due to the Ukrainians, you know, concentrating their forces. They had some reserves we don't know about, and they just slammed into the line. It's not that simple. And also, it probably would not be too wise if the Ukrainians did that, considering their manpower problems. Now, number one, the first reason why this is happening is that the Russians are having an issue with communication. And when I say an issue with communication, I mean a crisis with the communication. A lot of Russian drone teams required Starlink to function. They would pay $200, $300 to somebody in Kazakhstan, which would then get them a Starlink terminal registered outside of Russia. Then it would get them over into this area and allow them to use it for their military operations. Drone teams, Russian drone teams, were particularly reliant on these, because when you're operating that close to the front, those tiny Starlink terminals that you can relatively cover up with camouflage pretty well and get a solid enough connection to do drone operations, yeah, it's quite useful. And so it's not just useful for the Ukrainians. If the Russians can get Starlink terminal to work, it's going to be useful for them. It's going to be useful for both of them. So the Russians started getting them, not standardized from the Russian government, but they were getting them in mass, thousands of them, for sure. Now, the Ukrainian government says hundreds of thousands of Starlink terminals are operating in Ukraine, with tens of thousands of them at any one point currently operating on the front for military service. If the Russians are operating thousands of them, though, on the front line, that's still a massive communication failure for the Ukrainians, considering that should be a Western company that is working and has contracts with the Ukrainian government. Why is its equipment with no contract being used against Ukraine? And in 2025, the use of these Starlink terminals, which was reported in 2024, started to increase. And not only did we see these Starlink terminals being used by drone teams, if you're a Russian infiltrator, and this has become a more common Russian tactic, where you're having 2-3 guys kind of crawl over, maybe they have a camouflage blanket, maybe they just kind of try to run along the tree lines, maybe they try to use a scooter and then get behind Ukrainian lines, hold in position, wait for more people to come, consolidate, and then once they've consolidated enough people, they attack. How do you communicate with those people? If you have a Starlink terminal and a backpack, that could be very useful. It's another use for it. How do I describe it? It's not that this is the only tool at their disposal. For these teams, they can use Telegram, even though that is also now being targeted by the Russian government. They can use their cell phone, but if you use your cell phone, that could be targeted by the Ukrainians, because if it bumps off a Ukrainian cell phone tower, you might as well just say, Ukraine, please kill me. Ukraine, please kill me. You're giving them your location. They can try to use Russian radio communications, but there's massive corruption scandals around Russian radio communications. They can try to use like geospatial, like satellite tech, but that's not going to work for drones. It's not fast enough. It's just not. It's too far of a distance at a satellite. Not to mention, for those satellite systems, they worked with the French, and that's a security concern of its own. Point is, you look at every single other communication process, either for direct communication risk from the Ukrainians, communication risk from the West, the fact that it's slower, the fact that it has other security risks, the fact that it might be unencrypted. I mean, at the start of the war, you guys might recall on this channel, we were listening to Russian communications on radios, on the public radio. We could just tune into their frequency on public radio and listen to Russian radio communications. So having Starlink gave them a way to have relatively fast, low orbit satellites where you have to travel a lot less than the, the higher satellites that the Russians actually do have in orbit. And it meant fast video feeds that they could get a relatively okay view of the front. Now, let me tell you, I've been in these trenches with the Starlinks, and sometimes it cuts out. There have been reports of outages on the Ukrainian side. Elon Musk did cut Ukraine's Starlink terminals when they were trying to do an attack on Crimea, which was interesting considering how long they waited to do a whitelist approach, which is how they're combating now Russian, use of Starlink terminals. They waited so long to do this while the Russians were using them. But I would say the big warning sign for the Ukrainians, really, that they should have been worried about for the Russian Starlink terminal usage, as they were becoming more and more reliant on the system, was when those Starlink terminals started showing up on Russian attack drones. Because if they have enough of them that they can put them on Russian attack drones to attack Ukrainian energy infrastructure, and then possibly add the ability to control it from Moscow, or the ability to not be jammed, it just made it a lot more difficult. And it wasn't just even the more expensive drones. There were some cheaper drones even showing these Starlink terminals. And so that meant that there was a solid flow of Starlink terminals into Russia, that they felt that they could use them in a kamikaze capacity while also still having them go to the front lines. So this became a bigger and bigger issue. It helped Ukrainian drone pilots. It helped Russian drone pilots. It helped Russian infantry. It helped Russian communication. It helped Russian drones for long-range attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, and Ukrainian military production, and Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. The power outages, do you think none of those drones that struck Ukraine had Starlink terminals on them? Either way, this became a massive security risk for Ukraine, when before, again, Ukraine was having its Starlink terminals cut when it had an official contract with the armed forces. There were outages. And before that, when Elon Musk came in, it was like, we're going to give you Starlink terminals, and everyone knew that they're using them for military purposes. He was cutting them on a whim. But somehow the Russians, for all of 2025, continued to gain momentum with Starlink usage. To the fact command knew it, like the average Russian soldier knew it, any Russian drone pilot knew it. So what did change? What changed here? Well, a whitelist. A whitelist is different from just say, hey, here's one account, can you get rid of that? Hey, here's one account, can you get rid of that? Which was one of the approaches that was used. Instead, what it does, it says, hey, any Ukrainian drone team that is using these Starlink terminals, they're going to give their Starlink code, and they're going to give it to the Ukrainian government, which is going to give that Starlink code to Starlink, and they're going to register it near the front line, meaning that only near the front line, these codes on this whitelist, on this special Starlink code, could essentially do the streaming, could essentially do any drone attacks using Starlink. Any other Starlink in that area will not work. And in order to combat the drone attacks, the long-range drone attacks, they made it so that any Starlink terminal in Ukraine that's working in a civilian area, that means in areas like Kiev, Lviv, way from the front line, they have to be throttled. So they can only go about by 60 megabits. So there's a certain percentage of throttling they're going to do, so that if a drone tried to use Starlink to do a targeting, live targeting, it would be throttled, and it would make it very difficult for them to do it, which then not only hurts the Russians because of the whitelist, but also hurts their ability to try to remote control, use these drones to attack Ukraine. And let me tell you, if you were on Russian drone pilot Telegram channels, that was some of the purest salt I have ever gotten from the Russian salt mines. The purest salt. You have to understand the perspective from these people. They work every day with one goal in mind in order to get paid and try to, from their perspective, either win the war, get to the end of the war, or get home. And they know that from their perspective and the perspective of their leaders, they have to go in there and bring as much damage to the enemy as possible and do as many drone attacks as possible and advance as soon as possible, or the war will drag on for them, and it will drag on for them, and it will drag on for them. And it could mean their death, it could mean the death of their comrades, and it could mean possibly Russia's loss of the war. And so when that is what you hyper focus on for years and years and years, to the point where it's what you're looking at on military telegram channels, is what you're doing personally, commanding the drones, to have this tool that you had just taken away from you. So now you have to go rely on Russian state, the government contract, or hey, I got to go pay for a different Russian satellite provider, which is going to cost how much? Oh, it's going to cost 400 times more. Because of course, immediately once this crisis hit, they took advantage. They wanted to cash out. And so you're either going to have to pay a tremendous amount of money after having wasted your money on Starlink terminals, or you're going to go out and you're going to go on some fool's errand to pay some huckster who's going to take your money telling you, oh, yes, I can get you on the whitelist. And then they've pocketed $200. And a lot of those people are probably Ukrainian agents giving the money directly to the government. And that is what some groups have alleged, that they have done that if they've done it on scale. But that could also be the Ukrainians trying to, shake it up, say, hey, be scared. Don't try to get on the whitelist to prevent them. Either way, it has had a really scary effect from the Russian perspective of a drone pilot. From your perspective, you just lost one of your most reliable communication methods that gave you a clearest perspective of the front. And now you have to be reliant on either more expensive methods that are not going to be as good, or you're going to have to go for more analog options. So this is going to be a real problem for Russian drone pilots, especially those that have to be reinforced anyway to get new equipment. And so during this period of Starlink outages, the Ukrainians launched a counterattack. And I think that a lot of these positions, with either a lack of communication or a lack of drone support, have been able to make progress. And there has been reports from the Ukrainian government that after the Starlink outages, the amount of clashes along the front line dropped by like a rate of about like 30 to 40% on many days. So they dropped a significant amount. Now that doesn't mean it's going to be like that forever, but it does indicate that, not supported by as much drone power, as a lot of them have not been able to use Starlink, and their infantry that's doing the infiltrating not being able to get that type of communication, not being able to reinforce those on the front line with water and food as easily because of that lack of communication software, it has had an effect. And while, of course, they can adjust and they will adjust, and some of this effect will be blunted with time, even though, of course, not having access to Starlink will be a problem for those Russian pilots and those Russian commanders and those Russian infantry that have become reliant on it. In the immediate term, this means the Ukrainians can take advantage. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen some progress here, is the Ukrainians taking advantage of the Starlink outage. Another part is, I think there's two things happening here. I think there's a counteroffensive, and I think that there's Russian lies catching up with it. Whereas what I mean is, there's Russian commanders going out there saying, we've caught this position, we've caught that position, but all they did is they had a guy go around there with a flag, wave it around, then he got blown up, and then that was that. Or the dude went there, got in a hole, they held it for a little bit, and then the Ukrainians with a small, infantry team was able to take it back, but they marked it as captured, and they didn't say it was disputed, even though there was like a mix of soldiers, and there's still some Ukrainian positions there. And there's a lot of Russian over embellishment, where if a Russian soldier, there's a Russian saying that Putin keeps saying, where the Russian soldier, wherever the Russian soldier steps is Russia. And I wonder if they've taken that thought so literally that wherever the Russian soldier steps immediately becomes Russia. No need to reinforce. We can just report that it's captured, even if there's another Ukrainian foot like 500 meters away from you. And so I think this Russian over embellishment was taken at face value sometimes by an over optimistic Russian Telegram channels, and a lot of these positions are being lost, leading to a bigger feel of impact from the Russian side at the same time. So I do think this is a little bit of communication failure with Starlink being cut. I think this is a bit of the Russians over embellishing and those lies catching up with them. And I would also think that this is partially that the Russians are preparing for a spring and summer offensive that is to be expected. They want to take advantage of the conditions then, but they wanted to keep up the pressure during the winter months. But that doesn't mean that endless assaults do not tire out soldiers. That does not mean endless assaults don't come with consequences. And one of those consequences is that if you have a communication failure or if you overstretch yourself, that could be taken advantage of. And so I think all of these factors came together for a moment, despite Ukraine's manpower shortages, and they were able to take advantage of it to get the largest gains since 2023. So I don't think that this necessarily is a show of Russian frontline collapse. I don't think that this is a necessarily a show of things to come. While I think, something like pushing the Russians out of the Dnipro region is something that is conceivable if the Ukrainians want to dedicate some manpower reserves, take advantage of this moment right now to do it. How much the use of that manpower would be of use in the long term, whether you would want to reserve it, if that's what commanders want to do, is a totally separate question. But I don't think that this is a sign of wider frontline collapse. I don't think this is going to lead to, say, the Russians being pushed out of the wider like Hulepule area and then pushed back into oh my gosh, we're reestablishing the old Zaporizhia flank. No, I don't think that's going to happen. What I do think is going to happen is that the Russians could continue to lose some more villages, could continue to lose some more territory, and it's going to delay what would have been months and months of work that they already had gotten done. And now it's going to take them months and months of work and more manpower to try to do that work again. And going into the summer offensive, they might have to try to make gains that they wanted to make during the winter months, which is something that has happened a lot during this war. This is just a faster example of it happening in a pinpoint moment because the Ukrainians could take advantage of Russian communication failures, no longer having their system supported by Starlink satellites. So I think this is much more of a moment of time than a show of wider momentum shifting generally. And I think that's the honest portrayal. Very frustrating for the Russians. Throws back their offensive deadlines, and it does show that this idea of just Russian overdominance and over looming crushing power that can just overwhelm the end. That's not necessarily true. As people continue to say, because people haven't been paying attention to the war, oh, the Russians are winning, the Russians are winning. What is winning? Is this the speed of winning? I mean, look at. I mean, this is 2 months of gains that they've made. We're looking at this is the speed, and this is considered relatively faster gains in comparison to what they were making in like 2023, 2024 in many periods. So at the end of the day, this is a counteroffensive on a small scale. If you're talking about Ukraine at large, that has had a nominally big impact on Russia as a whole when it comes to, I think, the Russian armed forces communication and its deadlines for what they want to meet with their offensives. But I don't think that it's going to lead to anything wider than frustrated Russian deadlines, some Russian infantry losses, and them having to diversify their communication network with their drones no longer being able to utilize Starlink for long-range strike attacks, or the drone teams utilizing it for FPV and drone bomber missions.